Have you ever felt stuck, even when everything around you seems to be working? You wake up, follow your routine, fulfill your obligations, but inside, something feels stalled, as if a part of you has disconnected from the flow of life. The motivation that once drove you now feels distant. The projects that once excited you now barely get you out of bed. And even when you achieve something, the joy is fleeting, almost artificial. A subtle but constant emptiness insists on accompanying every step. It's not due to a lack of effort. In fact, you try. You read books, watch motivational videos, set goals, make plans. For a few weeks, you even feel a bit better, but soon the cycle repeats. It's like walking in circles. You begin to wonder if there's something wrong with you. And then the most painful question starts to arise. Is this the life I'm going to live forever? Always trying to change, but always ending up in the same place? This kind of stagnation is not uncommon, and it doesn't necessarily have a visible cause. Sometimes life even seems good on the outside, but on the inside, everything feels colorless, a repetition disguised as progress. Days that drag on, decisions that don't move forward, a desire for something new without knowing exactly what it is. Maybe you're asking yourself, but why is this happening to me? I want to change, I'm trying, so why doesn't anything change? That's the question that starts echoing louder and louder, especially when conventional methods of overcoming fail. When the problem doesn't seem to be in the external world, but in something deeper, more internal. Something that can't be solved with willpower or productivity alone. This feeling of being stuck, this sense of powerlessness in the face of your own life, carries a message that most people ignore. Stagnation is not the problem itself. It's the symptom. It's a sign. A silent call that something inside you is asking to be seen, recognized, maybe even accepted. Something that can no longer be hidden beneath the routine, the social smile, or the goals you think you should be achieving. It's at this point that we begin to understand that the real obstacle is not in the world, but within us. And it is precisely here that the ideas of Carl Jung start to make sense. Because according to him, what holds us back is not what we lack, but what we insist on hiding. Stagnation is often the reflection of an invisible battle being waged inside us. A battle against parts of who we truly are, which we learned early on to repress, ignore, or even fear. And maybe that's the first step, to stop fighting the symptom and start listening to what it wants to say. When Jung began exploring the human unconscious, he noticed something that went far beyond superficial emotions or rational thoughts. He discovered a hidden dimension, an inner space where we store everything we've learned to reject about ourselves. Anger, envy, selfishness, fear, contradictory impulses, everything considered ugly, undesirable, or dangerous, was thrown into this psychological basement he called the shadow. But the shadow doesn't disappear just because you chose to ignore it. On the contrary, the more it's repressed, the more it acts between the lines. It disguises itself in impulsive choices, silent self-sabotage, repeated relationship patterns, projects abandoned halfway. It influences how you see the world, how you react to criticism, and even how you relate to your dreams. That's why, even while trying to change, many people feel like they're running against an invisible inner force, a force that, in fact, is part of themselves. From a young age, we were conditioned to show only the acceptable side. Be strong, be polite, be positive, be productive. Everything that fell outside that pattern was pushed out of our awareness. But what was denied didn't cease to exist. And it's exactly this that begins to surface when we feel that life has stopped flowing. Emotional and existential stagnation is often the muffled cry of the shadow asking for recognition. It doesn't want to dominate you. It just wants to be seen. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That doesn't mean diving into chaos, but rather taking responsibility for who you truly are, with all your contradictions, desires, and unresolved aspects. Because as long as you don't face what you hide, you'll continue to be manipulated by it. This silent internal war may be the true reason behind your stagnation. It's not laziness. It's not failure. It's inner conflict. A conflict between what you show and what you are. Between what you believe you should feel and what you actually feel. And as long as that division exists, every effort to change will be like running with the handbrake on. Recognizing the shadow is not a sign of weakness, it's an act of courage. Because only those willing to face what they've avoided their whole life can finally be freed from what unknowingly holds them captive. And paradoxically, it's in this descent that true movement begins. Not an external movement, but an internal shift, from denial to integration. And maybe that's exactly the hidden invitation behind your stagnation. And it's precisely here that we begin to enter a deeper process, which Jung called individuation. A process that is not about becoming someone new, but about recognizing who you've always been, beyond the masks, beyond the defenses, beyond the shadows. If the shadow represents what you tried to forget about yourself, the process of individuation is the path to remembering, not theoretically, but experientially. Because to individuate, for Jung, was not about fitting into an ideal of the perfect person, but about becoming whole. Becoming who you truly are, with your light and your shadows, your gifts and your pain. It's curious how life, when it senses you're straying too far from your essence, begins to push you back. And it almost never does so with flowers or rewards. Usually the first push comes disguised as crisis, loss, or paralysis, as a stagnation that feels unfair but holds a silent invitation to look inward. And it is precisely that inward gaze that marks the beginning of the individuation journey. On the surface, you may be looking for practical solutions, more focus, more motivation, more discipline. But deep down, what your soul is asking for is depth. It's asking for reconnection, because no one feels stuck by accident. The feeling of stagnation often arises when the life you've built no longer fits who you're becoming. And then comes the discomfort, the unexplained fatigue, the desire to change without knowing where to go. It's at this point that many people get lost, trying to return to a past where everything seemed simpler. But the truth is that the path isn't backward, it's inward. Individuation is that call, a gradual, non-linear process where you begin to gather the fragmented parts of yourself. The desires that were suppressed, the truths that were swallowed, the fears you never wanted to feel. All of this begins to be brought to light, not to destroy you, but to complete you. Jung believed that every person carries within themselves an innate potential for fulfillment. But this potential doesn't manifest as long as we live only according to external expectations. Individuation requires the courage to disobey what the world expects and listen to what the soul needs. It requires silence, reflection, and above all, honesty. There is no quick formula, but there is a direction. And maybe that's the true reason why you feel stuck. Because something inside you no longer wants to keep pretending. Because your stagnation may not be a mistake, but a portal. A turning point between who you believed you were and who you have the chance to become. And from that point on, we begin to realize how trapped we are in fabricated versions of ourselves. Versions created to please, survive, or simply fit in. But which, deep down, no longer represent us. And that's where we enter another essential aspect of Jungian thought. The social masks we wear every day, and the deep impact they have on our relationship with our own truth. When Jung spoke about the persona, he wasn't just referring to the masks we wear from time to time. He was talking about an entire character we build in order to survive in the world. From an early age, we learn that showing who we really are can bring rejection, judgment, even pain. So without realizing it, we begin to shape a more acceptable, more functional, more praised version of ourselves. Jung called this adapted version the persona. It isn't inherently a problem. We all need a persona to function socially, at work, in relationships, in everyday life. But what happens when we start confusing this mask with our true identity? When we spend so much time performing that we forget who is behind the role? The answer is simple, but devastating. We lose touch with our essence. And sooner or later, that takes a toll. This disconnection is what creates internal distance. The feeling that you're living a life that isn't really yours. You might have success, relationships, stability, but none of it feels fulfilling. Because what should be an expression of your being has turned into the maintenance of an appearance. And so, even when surrounded by people, you feel alone. Even when everything seems in place, something feels missing. And it is you. The persona is clever. It learns to say what's expected, to do what seems right, to mold itself to expectations. But it comes at a cost. It suffocates authentic parts of who you are. Sometimes the desire to say no, the urge to change direction, or the impulse to create something new. All of this gets repressed just to keep the mask from cracking. But living like this, trying to sustain an edited version of yourself, is exhausting. And there comes a point when your body, your emotions, your life, everything starts to shut down. Stagnation, then, isn't just a block. It's a sign of betrayal. Not toward others, but toward yourself. A life lived through the persona is a partial, limited life. And the more you try to fit in, the further you move away from your own wholeness. Jung said that individuation is only possible when you can separate the persona from the self. In other words, when you stop believing you are the mask. This separation is painful at first. It requires questioning what you thought you knew about yourself. It demands letting go of labels, abandoning old roles. But it's through this process that you begin to rediscover yourself. And more importantly, you begin to experience a kind of freedom that doesn't depend on external approval. A freedom born from alignment between what you feel and how you live. And that alignment begins with discomfort. The same discomfort that, now, begins to make sense. Because maybe what you're feeling isn't just suffering. Maybe it's a plea for change. A message rising from the depths of your psyche, trying to alert you that it's time to stop performing and finally start being. Perhaps one of the hardest things to accept is that pain has a purpose. That discomfort isn't necessarily a mistake, but a message. Something inside you is trying to surface, not to destroy you, but to awaken you. And the strange thing is, the more we resist, the more it persists. As if life itself insists on stopping us until we listen to what we don't want to hear. The stagnation you feel may be exactly that. Not a punishment, but a mirror. A reflection of ignored parts, of unspoken truths, of changes that have been delayed for far too long. The sense of being unable to move forward might be your psyche's way of protecting you from continuing in the wrong direction. It's a difficult paradox to accept. Discomfort is often an ally. It signals that you're out of alignment, that something needs to emerge, to be confronted, transformed. And this doesn't happen on the surface, or with quick fixes. Stagnation demands a different kind of listening. A slow listening. A listening that only begins when you stop trying to fix everything from the outside in and start asking yourself, honestly, what inside me is being ignored? It's at this point that deep self-awareness practices become truly valuable. Not as mystical rituals or productivity hacks, but as tools to access what has been silenced. Writing in a journal, for example, the well-known practice of journaling, can reveal things you didn't even realize you were feeling. Therapy can expose patterns you thought you had outgrown. Recurring dreams can show you, through symbolic images, what your conscious mind still can't articulate clearly. Discomfort is a map. It points inward, toward where it hurts, where you avoid, where your truth resides. And the closer you get to that core, the more you realize that the pain isn't punishing you, it's guiding you. Perhaps that's why Jung said, where your wound is, there lies the path of the soul. Of course, this path isn't easy. It takes courage to abandon the stories you've told yourself your whole life. It requires the willingness to sit with silence, with doubt, with anger, with guilt. But only through this can real change begin. Not from the outside in, but from the inside out. Because true transformation doesn't come from trying to control life. It comes from learning to listen to what life is trying to reveal. And maybe, deep down, this stagnation you're living through is exactly that. A silent call to return to yourself. To make space for what's been repressed. To allow the pain to fulfill its role as a messenger. And then finally, to open the way for something new. And that new doesn't begin with big revolutions. It begins with a simple act of sincerity. To stop running and start listening. Because it's in that stillness, where there once was frustration, that the possibility of freedom begins. Maybe you're beginning to realize that this feeling of stagnation that's been with you for so long wasn't the end. It was the beginning, a sign, a turning point. And no, there was never anything wrong with you for feeling this way. Because sometimes, it's precisely when everything feels stuck, still, directionless, that the soul is just starting to move within. The pain that seemed pointless, the fatigue without cause, the constant discouragement, none of it was random. All of it was, in some way, an attempt to call you back to yourself, to look more deeply, to truly feel, to break away from what no longer makes sense, and above all, to stop running from what has always lived inside you. The shadow, the persona, the false self, the forgotten desires, the repressed anger, the dormant dreams. All of it was part of you. But you weren't taught to integrate these parts. You were taught to erase them, to repress them, to adapt. But the soul doesn't want adaptation. It wants expression. It wants wholeness. And as scary as that may seem at first, it's on this path that true freedom resides. Individuation, the process Jung described as becoming who you are, is not a distant destination. It's an intimate journey, a quiet journey, a deeply personal journey. And it begins now, at the very point where you thought you had failed. It begins in the stagnation. It begins in the discomfort. It begins the moment you decide to stop running from yourself and for the first time, start walking toward your truth. You don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to transform overnight. You just need to accept the invitation. The invitation to look within with honesty, to make peace with who you are, to allow discomfort to show you what is ready to be born. Because in the end, what you most avoid is exactly where your liberation lies. So if today you feel like life has come to a standstill, don't despair. This pause may be sacred. It may be the necessary space for a new version of you, not invented, not programmed, but authentic, to begin to emerge. This is not an end. It's a beginning. And maybe, just maybe, you're finally ready to take the first step. If this video made sense to you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep creating content that deepens self-awareness and psychology in an accessible and genuine way. Share it with someone who might also be feeling stuck. Let's walk this journey together.